Welcome to the Time to Practice podcast and our summer of practice tips. If you've never listened to the podcast before, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Christine Goodner. I'm a music educator, author, and podcaster who has made it my mission to talk about music practice and to support music educators and families looking to make home practice more effective and to help them also reduce conflict and frustration in the practice room. This episode is brought to you by my upcoming talk for families of music students called Setting Up for a Successful School Year in Music Lessons. And I'm going to be holding it in the afternoon at Pacific time on August 24th. Back to school is a great time to set intentions and routines for the year and remind ourselves of all the little things that can help support our child's music education for the year ahead. And we'll talk about that from various age range perspectives. I will have one rate for individual attendees and another rate for studios. So you can find information in the show notes of this episode or at suzukitriangle.com. Welcome back, everyone. We are wrapping up our series on perfectionists and perfectionist thinking this week on the podcast. We are joined by my friend and colleague, Claire Allen, who is going to join me in thinking about parents and families of music students and how we can support our young musicians. Also, we'll weave in some ideas about how teachers can support the families they work with as well. I would love to encourage you to revisit our episodes specifically about supporting students and perfectionism, episode 89 and 90, which I will link to in the show notes for this episode, because you can adapt some of the ideas we were talking about there specifically for your needs in the practice room as well. Claire and I want to remind you that we are not trying to label your child or have you label your child as perfectionist or not perfectionist. In this conversation, it's not really necessary to put any labels on anyone for these ideas to be helpful. In fact, I think while many of them work especially well to combat perfectionist thinking, getting in our way in the practice room, there are great ways for everyone to keep in mind how to think about practice for every single student. We're being really conscious in this series to stay in our lane as music educators and musicians who think about our own practice, share what we found works for ourselves and our students. But we are not mental health professionals, and none of what we say is meant to be mental health advice. Our goal is to better understand our children and our students that we work with and to discuss strategies that work for learning music and in our music practice time that can help us as musicians. So especially that can help us as parents or caregivers this week. All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to our final installment, at least for now, on this series about perfectionism. I am joined again by Claire Allen. Thanks, Claire, for being with me all these weeks on the podcast talking about this topic.
Of course.
It's been great we were just saying before we hit record just now, it's been great to have a relaxed amount of time to talk about this content. We both feel really passionate about it, and we hope that it's been helpful to you to think about. So today we are talking about how parents and caregivers can support their students at home and how teachers can support the parents and caregivers in their program, just the parent piece of supporting a music student in, especially in practice, I think, related to perfectionism.
And yeah, and my disclaimer here is that while I have a lot of experience being a student and a daughter and a perfectionist, and a teacher, I am not a parent. So I'm going to be chiming in with ideas from basically the fabulous parents in my studio who have, I've seen what they do that works with their kids. But I guess also for any teachers out there who are not parents, please feel that doesn't stop you from offering things of support. Christine is actually my secret to doing that. Once I discovered her and her awesome work, I would just start sending stuff to my studio families instead of being like, oh, well, don't take it from me, take it from this person who is a parent. So yeah, so these podcasts can hopefully be a great resource for you to support families if it feels a little vulnerable to, say, here I am, here's some advice on parenting as I, go home to my cat in my child-free house, which can feel not great always to say. So hopefully you get some good ideas here too.
Oh yeah, thanks for mentioning that part, Claire, because I do think teachers who are just starting out or who are not parents themselves tell me they feel self-conscious talking about this, but I think it's really helpful to share stories I heard on this podcast. I've heard another parent share, just gather stories or get your studio families together in one room and ask the more experienced parents who have been doing this a while with their kids to share tips with the newer families in your studio. And sometimes hearing from other parents is even more powerful than hearing from the teacher. So there's a lot of ways you can weave in other people's stories and experiences. And of course, you as the teacher are the expert on learning the instrument and you have all your training and instrument experience to draw from. So I hope you feel competent and ready to support your families because really people just need to be heard and have a space to hear advice, even if you're not a parent yourself. I think it's really important. So we want to talk. Let's maybe start talking. In our presentation, we talked about how teachers, because we were talking to teachers at this conference, can support the parents and caregivers in their program. And so I'll kind of share some of my points from that perspective, but we'll weave in parents and how you're going to support your child as well. And one thing we can do as teachers, I think, and educators is offering perspective to the families we work with. I think if you're a parent, it might be really helpful to know, like we've talked about vibrato some on this podcast series, like, oh, this is a skill that takes, many months, if not a year, for some students to feel like, oh, I'm somewhat happy with how this sounds when I'm putting it into a piece of music. And just knowing, like, oh, this thing can be learned in a week and this other thing might take years to learn. That's a really helpful perspective that we can share with the families we work with. And if you're the parent or caregiver, it's perfectly valid to ask, like, is this typical for this to take a long time to learn? That's a good question to ask too, so that what to expect. And if we haven't played the instrument ourselves, we may not know what timeline things are expected to be accomplished on. And that can be a really important thing. I think also sharing information we've learned as teachers with the families, or if you're a family member, you could share what you've learned with your child. I think if you're supporting your child in practice, you can be like, oh, I've learned, this is a good moment to put our feet up on the wall and take a big breath, or I heard someone share XYZ about their practice. I think sharing information can be really helpful if we're giving opinions like I think you should or you need to, whether we're the teacher or the parent. I think it comes across different than someone told me once this helped them, or oh, I read something about this, or let's try this together. So I think sharing of information can be a really good way to work with one another.
Yeah, my students know every time I come back from conference, they're like, "Oh, she's going to come back with at least like one new thing, right?" So I was at conference last week and I went to this presentation and I want to try this thing with you.
Right.
Um, so they're pretty used to that by now, but that can be great to model for them too as a teacher or as a parent. Just like, hey, we went somewhere and we learned new information and now we're going to absorb that as opposed to just, oh yeah, I know everything.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I think it's really helpful to point people to resources. So if we're a teacher supporting families in their studio, just pointing them to this podcast series. If there's a particular episode you think could help a family member, articles. I know any resources I create that are on my website or any of these podcasts, sort of a labor of love for me. The biggest thing I get out of it is I'm just helping other people. There's a lot out there that we can find. We're lucky to have a lot of online resources. So you don't have to have the answer. If a parent comes to you and says, help, my child is showing these perfectionist tendencies, what do I do? You can point them to resources. And again, it doesn't have to be a mental health professional. It could be, but it could be, here's a book I heard about, here's a podcast I heard about, here's an article I read. Pointing to resources can be really a helpful thing we can do to support the families we work with.
Yeah, I maintain a reading list for them. All of your books are on it, of course, and some other ones so that they get sent when they join my studio. Like, here's a list of resource like books that you can read to or listen to if you're an audiobook person to learn more about this.
Yeah, and I'll put a couple books that I found when researching perfectionism that I sort of added to my own studio library in the show notes about this perfectionist topic. If you're a parent listening or a teacher listening, like I would like some resources beyond this podcast, there's a couple books that I found really helpful. So when I've put them out on display on the bookshelf in my studio, and I've since this talk, have had a couple parents pick them up and look through them on the during a lesson when they're listening to their student play and be like, oh, I need to get this in the library, or I need to get a copy of this, or this was helpful for me to read today and think about. So I think those resources can be really helpful. Along those lines, too, avoiding blame, I think, is really important. If we are a parent ourselves or a caregiver and we see our child showing these perfectionist tendencies, I think it's really important not to blame ourselves and be like, did I cause my child this or that? Like maybe we want some self reflection. Do I do this myself? Do I want to change that about myself? But I don't think it's helpful to beat ourselves up or get into that inner critic kind of thing of like, this is all my fault, because we likely got it from somewhere else as well. And also, it's not blaming the teacher like, oh, it's because of the way the teacher's teaching or it's this or that. I think is really not helpful on any side of our working relationship to be blaming one another. But I do think it's helpful to maybe have a conversation of, could we talk about how to support the student? We see them struggling with a certain thing, but I don't think blame is very productive.
No, not at all.
Yeah. And I think if I blame someone else, I'm less likely to do the reflecting on what is within my control that I can change. So I always think about that when it's easy to be like, oh, this person's fault. But then if I can just think about like, what could I actually control? Okay, I could have a talk with the teacher about supporting the student. I could read for myself. I could reflect for myself. All that's not easy work, not simple to do, but I think important to keep in mind. We've talked about this a lot in this series, but we're going to say it again, is acknowledging there are no quick fixes. So just like listening to this podcast series is not going to fix someone's lifelong struggle with perfectionist thinking. It might give us one step in the right direction. Changing the way we talk to our students in the lesson or in practice. There's like a lot of baby steps we've talked about in this podcast. And if you did every single one of them, still not quick fixes. These are long-term projects that we're undertaking here. And hats off to anybody willing to just be like, I see this issue. I want to tackle it. And we'll just encourage you to have a lot of patience. And maybe just you and the teacher can have, or the teacher and the parent can have a conversation. Okay, well, we're all working on this. We can acknowledge that, 10 years from now, we're probably going to look back and be like, wow, look what we can, like Claire's student, she mentioned in an earlier podcast, we can see that this paid off, but it might be really hard to see it at this moment. So anything you want to say about the quick fix perspective, Claire?
I'm still looking for one. No, it just takes time, and I find myself saying that to parents a lot. Is often they want to know, when is my kid going to be advanced? When is my kid going to finish this book? When is my kid going to be able to audition for this orchestra? And I think it takes time is probably their least favorite answer. And I struggle with feeling like I'm disappointing them, or like, oh, if I say, oh, you can't do this yet, they're going to think, oh, she's a bad teacher, she didn't get us to this level by this point. So I've learned to say it takes time, and say realistically this is the type of work it takes, and about how long it will take depends. Mileage may vary. So I think just trying to be, like we've said all along, being realistic and clear about the work. And then I think for parents, being realistic and clear about the work to your kid. I see this a lot with older students. Like I said, in my area, we have just fabulous orchestra programs in and outside of schools that are so motivational for students, but it can often be such a source of frustration because they want to get in the top orchestra. When I say that, like, no, we're not going to, I'm not going to prep you for that audition this year because of X, Y, and Z. I try to be really clear with them. And I think the parent can also, say, we totally understand you're working on these skills. Let's ask your teacher if there's more practice you can do or more strategies, but not saying like, oh, let's, I don't know. I've heard of some really crazy cases where like people change teachers every year if they don't move up an orchestra in this one youth orchestra. It's kind of like bonkers. And it's like, well, no, just have a conversation. And sometimes you're not going to go up a level every year, So it's like, what type of work needs to happen?
Right. You're taking a really long view. And I just think kind of countercultural
It really is.
for a lot of us where we live to do that with anything. And it's fair to feel frustrated or wish something went faster.
Oh, absolutely.
And also, this is a long-term project that we're in the midst of here. And really, I guess you have bragging rights, but really being in the top orchestra every year later in life does not really giving you much. So
Yeah, I think I'm trying to think if I still remember my high school GPA. I think I've finally forgotten it. It's taken over 20 years, but I think I've finally forgotten it.
but probably nobody's asking you for it very often, even if you remember.
No, and honestly, at this point, I've taught long enough too that, I mean, people can go on my website and read my teaching credentials if they want. But when I meet people, I'm like, hi, I'm Claire, I teach violin. And I see if I get along with them, and I see if I get along with the kid, and I see if
Right.
what I'm doing with the student in the room is helpful to them. And like, it doesn't matter if I've won a competition or play an orchestra, or if I play in a fancy orchestra. There's some people who think, oh, I have to study with someone in the symphony because that's going to be the highest level of teacher or whatever. I mean, and there's great players and there's great teachers in the symphony, but the right teacher for your kid might be someone who's just not interested in taking orchestra auditions. So I think the more that parents can model that healthy perspective, even as countercultural as it may be, and also, you know, not stoke the flames of competition or wanting to be in a certain thing, it can help.
Yeah. And then I guess one more thing I'll say about how teachers and music educators can support families is just modeling and sharing strategies. We shared a lot of strategies in the last couple episodes about supporting students. And I think sharing those with the families in your program, whether you just verbally share them, print something out for them, send them in a podcast episode, whatever that looks like for you. That's a way that we can really help is like, here's some things to try at home, or here's some things other parents have told me work well for them. Let's give it a try. And we've said perfectionism and just student learning in general is not a one size fits all. What helps one person might be counterproductive for another. So I'm going to take the cues from the child and do what works. I think that's an important thing to say to families.
Mm-hmm.
If I just say like, well, my kids needed this, that's what you should do. That doesn't translate for everybody. And then I do want to say something about musician parents who are practicing with their own kids. You may or may not be your child's private teacher, but even so, there's a certain frustration that musician parents tell me when I do workshops and classes that they struggle with is that, like we've mentioned in other episodes, they see all the things that are not quite right. And so do we as the teacher, and we're picking one to work on, right? And parents who are musicians, a lot of them will tell me they just can hardly bite their tongue. It feels like physically painful not to list out like, well, this wasn't correct and that wasn't correct and that wasn't correct. And they just feel like they just have to say it to their child. And parents have told me their child will no longer practice with them anymore because they find it demoralizing to be just have all their flaws in their face all the time. And the parent will be like, I can see that that's happening and I want to stop and I just can't help myself. It just comes out. And so I just want to acknowledge that dynamic. When I say this in a room of teachers who are parents, there's always laughter because people are like, that's me. And so you're not alone. It's not just you. I think if you feel like you have to get it out of your system, these things that you see but are not the thing to focus on right now, I tell people to get out a pen and paper or an app in their phone where they write notes and just jot them down so they're out of your body and your brain. But it really will, if we think of that long view we've been talking about, your child to get to the next step is going to need to work on the one thing at a time that they can handle. And they need to not feel overwhelmed that they're going to be just buried in criticism when they play. And you may also need to get that out of your system. And so then give yourself a nonverbal way to do that and write it down. And just acknowledge maybe that this is hard for me to sit here and support my child and help them be self compassionate when it has been trained into me to see every flaw. There is a challenge there that non-musician parents will tell me, I don't know if I can help my child with practice. I am not a musician. And sometimes I'm like, I think you might have an easier time because you're just going to do what the teacher tells you and you're not going to really have this angst about, but I see this other thing that we're not addressing right now. And, the teacher, most teachers I know are also seeing the thing you're seeing, musician parents, but, we're just trying to figure out what will help the child right now. So anyway, I want to acknowledge that that is a real challenge for musician parents. It can be really hard to not say all the things that are not, quote, perfect to our child in the practice.
And I've also worked with some families who the parents are musicians, but grew up in a very strict authoritarian kind of practice environment and are really consciously trying to create something different for their children. And they've talked to me about feeling caught in that, balance between like, this is how I was parented and made to practice. I don't want my child to feel like this. So they're working on how much feedback do I give. And they might err on the side of, giving less feedback and letting their kid kind of do more whatever, or being scared of even telling their kid to practice because they had such horrible experiences themselves. So I think just kind of being aware of wherever parents are with their own relationship to music and music practice, and then, consciously choosing what they want to bring into the room with their child.
Right. So we affirm you as a parent in that. And I think this is an argument for having those parent teacher conferences or having a conversation with your teacher. Because if I know that about a parent, like I'm hesitant to give any feedback, I just want to encourage because it was so negative for me, then maybe I'm going to be not harsher, but more direct about the feedback I'm giving in the lesson and a little more strict with what I'm expecting you to do this or this, depending on the age of the student, of course, this is how I'm going to deliver that. But
Mm-hmm.
if I know that the parent really needs an encourager role and that's what they're willing to do, then I'm going to give my feedback a little bit differently depending on the student's age. And it's helpful for us to know that and have an open conversation. I'm not going to tell the parent, you have to do blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, they have this relationship with their child that they get to have one of these,
Right.
right? And so, how do we navigate this and support each other? I think that's an important conversation. All right, well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about during music practice for parents and caregivers. What can you do to support your child? Now, we've talked about this, like woven this into all of our episodes, I feel like in various ways. But some things that a lot of experts recommend related to perfectionism in children and students, one is make it really clear that mistakes are part of the learning process. And we expect mistakes, especially when playing a musical instrument. If we just picked up our instrument and played perfectly from the start, we would not need years of instrumental training and lessons with the teacher. And I will give really specific phrases that will be like, oops, or that's why we practice. And, or I'll just point out to them the musician you're hearing on your recording, Hilary Hahn, for example, and this is a key book one right now. She did not play it like you're hearing on the recording the first time she picked up a violin. This is lots of years of practice. And so I think just making friends with the fact that we will make mistakes and that's how we learn is really an important part of supporting our children in practice. And maybe we have to deal with our own anxiety about them. Like we've talked about before in other episodes, making mistakes and tell ourselves the same thing, like they are going to learn through mistakes. Sometimes we learn more through a mistake than doing something perfectly the first time because then we really like think about it differently. Anything you want to say about that, Claire?
Sometimes I'm trying to think who it is. This quote might be apocryphal, but someone said that Yo-Yo Ma once said in a performance he relaxes as soon as he makes his first mistake because now the pressure of it being like perfect isn't there anymore.
Mm,
So I think just normalizing it, and as a teacher, I try not to react when my students make a mistake too much, unless it is something that I have reminded them about for years and or weeks up to it, and then I will jump right in and be like, no, no, we're not doing that anymore. But when it's like the first time, and especially if it's like a younger kid, it's like, oh, okay, that's fine, let's try again.
right, right. And I've heard the advice in arenas not related to music of notice as a parent at home, caregiver at home, what do you do, for example, if you drop a plate and break it in the kitchen, or you forget your grocery list at home, or you drop something or forget something, and not to blame yourself, but to give yourself an opportunity to demonstrate to your child how might one react when they make a mistake.
Mm,
And I think it's very hard to do. I wouldn't decide like I have to do this 100% of the time right, but even if just like once in a while you gave a good demonstration of what one does when you make a mistake and are kind to yourself, maybe do it out loud so your child can hear you and not just in your head.
mm-hmm.
And that can be really powerful. Again, not easy to do, but really powerful. I think another thing is helping students learn when they have done enough work for the day and practice is over. Because some students might just be like, I would like practice to be over as soon as I start. But there's some students who are going to really have that, I want to fix this today. And it's not a one day fix it kind of situation. And they just would practice sort of obsessively or over and over and not stop. And so for those students, you might need to be like, here's our time limit, or we're going to do it this many times and we're going to stop. I think giving some now, this is how we define when we're done for the day and when we pick up the work again tomorrow, because this is such a long term process.
Yeah, I have kind of two examples, I guess, to share that's relevant to that. One is I have a lot of families, when you're early on, you do your little finger exercises, you do your little scale, you play your one or two pieces and you're done, right? But then eventually, as the child's experience grows, the assignment list grows. And then it gets to the point where it might not be practical to do every single thing on the list to completion every single day. And for people who are more perfectionists, this might be really bothersome. So something that can be really helpful, I have somewhere buried in my office. It's the end of the year. It's a little messy. Oh, a whiteboard that's about the size of a piece of paper. And what I'll do is I'll write down like today's tasks. So you might have your notebook from your lesson or your practice chart that your teacher gave you, but you might say, okay, on Tuesday, we're going to do this thing, we're going to do this thing, and we're not going to play this whole piece, but we're going to play this section of it. We might do 2 lines of our note reading exercise, not the whole page. So just having that for your students so they still get the satisfaction of checking off everything on the list if you've got one of those kids. And they don't feel like, oh, I didn't circle everything on my practice chart because I didn't do it, because sometimes that can be anxiety producing.
Mm,
And then the other thing is I once had a parent email me in a panic the night before a recital because their teenager was practicing obsessively and getting more and more upset. So I wrote back and I said, have them make a list of 5 things, like 5 spots they want to practice, and 3 strategies for each. And then the violin has to go down. So
mm,
sometimes you just say, okay, well, this is what it is. I'm going to do these 3 things. And you follow the list and you don't let your brain wander. You follow the list and then you put it down. So, yeah, that idea of deciding when you're done. And I think, changing up the visual and creating that small targeted list for yourself can be really helpful for focusing.
sure, sure. Yeah, I like that example of finding a few things to do on each spot, and that can be hard. Some people might wish their child had the problem of they don't want to stop, but there's like the
Yeah.
two extremes are all both difficult. So I think also it's really important to help our children see and our students see that there two things can be true at the same time. So we can hopefully see we've made a lot of progress and there's room for improvement. Yes, it's so much better than it was, or now you can play through the whole piece without getting lost, for example, but we have these other things to work on. And holding those two things as true is really the opposite of the all or nothing thinking of the maladaptive perfectionism of it's all good or it's all bad. It's just
Mm,
we're in that messy middle. Can we see what two things are true? And I think just learning to do that has helped me balance my, you know, always feeling like I could do more.
hmm.
Because, yes, that's probably true. And a lot of things that I do that I could do more. And also, I just sometimes there's a reality of what we're can do today. So, all right. Another one is focus our feedback on effort rather than results. We've touched on this a little bit. Remembering a student may not be happy with low quality results, and we don't need to convince them to be happy with them, but we can help them balance that out with being kind to themselves or focusing on, okay, we worked really hard on this today. We keep doing this over time, it's going to improve or whatever that is. I think that's really important. And the self compassion, when I was reading a lot of resources on perfectionism, getting to that adaptive form, the number one piece of advice was self compassion, like really treating ourselves with that versus the self criticism is kind of the way to navigate through this. So, this is a way to practice helping our child do that.
Yeah. And that can just be like results in the practice room, but I think also kind of this bigger picture. I always tell people, especially if you're doing an exam or a competition or whatever, you celebrate the day, the second that audition is over. I always ask, like, what are you having for dinner after your audition? Or, because I say we celebrate your effort, we celebrate that you did it, we celebrate that you got through it, and then we find out if you got in or not, whatever.
Right.
So make sure you kind of build in your own like little celebration.
And then we do want to touch one more time on the fact that avoidance or procrastination can come from the fear of making mistakes, silliness, and really young students, like preschool students. If I see extreme silliness and it's like, where is this coming from? It's usually okay. We need to take a break or break this down to a smaller, more manageable chunk. But avoidance, procrastination, those can really be, I don't want to make a mistake, and so I'm not going to do the thing. And so we have that fear of being imperfect in front of others. I think it's helpful to know this isn't quote bad behavior or like your child's not behaving in the practice session. Why don't they do this in front of the teacher, but they do it in front of me? They may really want your approval as the parent in a totally different way than they're ever going to care about the teacher's approval.
Mm,
And so I think just putting that into context instead of my child is just really behaving in a way I don't understand in practice, I can be like, okay, I think this is coming from this fear of this. Maybe then we can have some strategies to step back and like give them a lower stakes or a lower pressure way of doing what we're asking.
mm-hmm.
So those are a few things that I think really come to mind of what we can do as parents. I did a talk once on developing character qualities for a group I was speaking to, and I read a bunch of articles on developing things like self compassion, perseverance, empathy, self compassion. We could put in this bucket, I think. And all the articles, as I was going through them, they sort of had three things in common of what kids need to develop these things. So this is what I want to leave you with as we're wrapping this up today. Students need and children need adults who will talk to them about developing these traits. They need to see it modeled by people around them. They need to see people doing the thing, not just telling them how they should be doing it. And they need to have a lot of chances to practice it. So, if we're talking about how do I approach the fact that I am, in fact, not going to be perfect when I play in the practice room or play for my teacher, we need teachers that are talking to us about it. We need parents who are talking to us about it and just like, oh, this, like I was saying earlier, Hillary Hahn did not sound like this. The first day she played her violin, this is a professional recording this. Um, they need to see us making mistakes. So sometimes as a teacher, we could make a mistake on purpose in front of our student in the lesson, or just acknowledge like I made a mistake by accident in front of my student in the lesson and let them know we in fact too are not perfect. As parents, we can find those things like I forgot something, I broke something, and I'm going to model being kind to myself or acknowledging my mistake and like integrating that healthily into my day. And then chances to practice it. If our child is in music lessons for many years, they are going to have chances to practice being imperfect and coming up against making mistakes or getting feedback on all of these things. And so we're putting them in an environment where they have a chance to practice that. I don't think we have to go out of our way to look for that, but we might want to look for ways that we can talk to them about all of this and model a healthy response to imperfection and mistakes and vulnerability and feedback so that we do what we can to make it as healthy of a process for them as possible.
Right. And it's not going to be easy, even if you know all the strategies. And even if the strategies are working, it still might not be easy.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a big topic that's so much about just like being human and existing in the world. And we
Mm-hmm.
just get a chance to have it right in our face when we're playing an instrument and we're basically trained
Pretty
musicians.
much.
So Yeah, Claire, thank you for joining me for all of these podcasts. I know, you might have listened if you got all the way to the end, it might just be a topic you're really interested in too, and you just want to learn more. So we hope that some of the resources we've linked to will help you. I know we are both open to talking to people more about this topic, or, coming to speak either individually or together to your group or your organization. About this topic, because it's something we've spent a lot of time thinking about for ourselves, for our students, and for people
Hmm.
like you who are listening, because we want kind of help you with what we've learned both the hard way and through our research.
Yeah. And it's more people are doing research all the time and having more lived experiences. So, we'll keep learning about different ways to work.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thanks so much, Claire, for all of your time. And it's always a pleasure to talk shop with you and talk about these topics with you. I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we go today, and as we wrap up this series, I have a few thoughts that I wanted to sort of summarize from our conversation today. First, it can be really helpful to talk with our children about a process for learning skills, especially skills that take a long time and that can't easily be gained right away. Sometimes that can be hard for children to grasp. So, I think also a good conversation to have with your teacher if you're not sure if you should be catching on faster, should in quotation marks there, and you're concerned as a parent or caregiver, or maybe your own perfectionism is feeling a little upset by the fact that it's taking a while and you're not sure if that's to be expected. So good things to think about and good things to have a conversation with our teacher about for sure. I think if you're a parent who's listening to this, one message I hope you'll take away is that there's really no need to blame ourselves if we see our child struggling with perfectionist thinking. Perfectionism can come from many internal and external factors. That's what our research showed us as we were preparing our original talk that prompted this series. And, it's fair to want to adjust some things or look for new ways to support our child moving forward with more awareness. But I think if we get stuck in the feeling that this is our fault, it can be a kind of counterproductive. So, from my perspective, it's more useful to notice, what does your child need, become more aware of how you can support them, and then we can adapt to that as parents. So, wherever those perfectionist tendencies may come from, I think the most helpful thing we can do now is just see what's going on, and then support our child going forward. I also want to remind you that you have a really powerful opportunity to model healthy responses to mistakes in front of your child. So, when we inevitably are also imperfect and we are doing our own mental adjustment or practicing being kind to ourselves about these things, I think just doing that a bit out loud or in front of our child so they can see our own coping skills, our own way we coach ourselves through. So, that can really help students adopt their own coping strategies or their own self compassion from seeing it modeled in front of them. That's super important. And then finally, I'll just say, if you have a student and child who is having trouble stopping practice because they just want to keep going and going, especially if progress that could be made for the day has been made and now we're sort of stuck in a loop, I think setting a limit on when practice is done for the day, or maybe just when it's time to move on from the hard, frustrating, I'm trying to work this out kind of thing in practice, and to switch to playing something for relaxation or fun, it could be really helpful to help our child create some ideas around how to do that. I hope you've enjoyed this series as much as Claire Allen and I have enjoyed recording it and sharing it with you. It's such an important topic. We could, go on and on about it, but I think we've covered quite extensive different angles in this series, which was really fun to be able to do. So we hope this prompts lots of food for thought, lots of further learning for you, lots of ideas moving forward. We thank you so much for sticking with us through this entire series. And if you know someone in your life who could benefit from listening to it, we encourage you to share an episode with them. I am looking forward to being back with you next week. I have a listener submitted practice tip that I'm going to share with you. And I'm having fun right now planning out episodes for the coming school year. So I have the fall pretty planned out. But if there's someone you would love to hear interviewed on the podcast, or a topic you would love to hear me talk more about, please reach out. I would love to hear from you. Christine@SuzukiTriangle.com. And we hope you do reach out also and just share, what did you take away from the series? What benefits did you find? What stuck with you? Or what did you learn? That helps us a lot to hear how what we did connected with you. A reminder, if you'd like to join me for my online session, Setting Up for a Successful School Year, on Sunday, August 24th, you can do that live. or sign up to receive the recording at suzukitriangle.com. I will also put a link to finding that in the show notes. And there will be a studio rate for that and an individual rates, depending on if you are just purchasing for yourself or if you'd like to have all the families in your studio have access to that. So these quarterly talks I offered definitely are what keep this podcast going and have allowed me so far to continue offering the podcast without outside ads, which I love. So until next week, I hope you have a productive week of practice, and I hope everyone takes very good care.